The question came from the edge of an excavation in an ordinary field in Suffolk. Was there anyone on this flight called Aaron Brinkoeter? The object that had prompted the question was small enough to hold between two fingers. It was an American military identification tag, stained by nearly 8 decades in the soil, but still carrying a readable name: Aaron Brinkoeter. The archaeologists knew it immediately. Brinkoeter had been the co-pilot of a B-17 flying fortress called Little Boy Blue. More importantly, he was one of 3 men from that aircraft who had never been recovered. The team had come to this field specifically to look for him. They had also come for pilot Walter Malaniak and radio operator Ronald Grey. All 3 had died here in 1944. Almost 80 years later, the location of the crash was no secret. The aircraft was known, its serial number was known, its crew was known. There were wartime photographs, eyewitness memories, earlier excavations, and pieces of wreckage scattered through the surrounding farmland. And yet, the recovery team faced a basic problem. They knew the field. They did not know exactly where within it the part of Little Boy Blue carrying the missing men had come down. The dog tag would eventually become the most personal discovery of the excavation. But to understand why such a small object mattered, the story had to return to a morning when Little Boy Blue was still an intact 4-engine bomber preparing to leave England. On July 19, 1944, B-17F serial 42-30851 stood at Nettishall in Suffolk, home of the 388th Bomb Group. Its nickname was Little Boy Blue. By that summer, it was already an experienced aircraft. It had survived more than 60 combat missions, an unusually long career for a bomber operating in the air war over Europe. Other crews had flown it before. Now another 10 young Americans were preparing to take it toward Germany. Their target that day was Schweinfurt. Among the men aboard were pilot Walter Malaniak, co-pilot Aaron Brinkoeter, radio operator Ronald Grey, right waist gunner Harold Haggerty, and tail gunner James Bennett. They would never reach the target. The trouble began while the bombers were assembling and climbing into formation over England. Little Boy Blue developed a power problem involving its No. 3 engine and the turbo supercharger system that helped the engine maintain performance at altitude. The exact mechanical details mattered less than the immediate result. Little Boy Blue began to fall behind. A large bomber formation was not simply a collection of aircraft flying in the same direction. Each machine was meant to occupy a particular place in a carefully organized stream. Once Little Boy Blue lost power, it also lost that place. The crew managed to restore the engine. The bomber could continue. But the situation around it had changed. While Little Boy Blue had been dropping back, aircraft from another formation were catching up from behind. The mechanical problem had not destroyed the airplane. It had put it somewhere it was not supposed to be. At roughly 15,000 feet over Suffolk, another B-17 closed on Little Boy Blue. It was B-17G serial 43-37623 of the 96th Bomb Group. The 2 bombers collided. For Hal Haggerty, sitting at the right waist position, the event was not remembered as an abstract collision between 2 aircraft. According to the account later preserved by his family, it arrived as the sound of metal grinding against metal. The propellers of the other bomber cut into Little Boy Blue near the waist section. Haggerty remembered the plywood flooring breaking upward into his face. Then the structure around him began to disappear. This was no longer a bomber trying to survive ordinary battle damage. The collision had physically cut open the airframe. The fuselage began to separate. The other B-17 was badly damaged, but remained controllable. Its crew would eventually get it back to an airfield. Little Boy Blue was beyond that point. For the 10 men inside it, the next seconds were no longer about completing a bombing mission, maintaining formation, or saving the aircraft. They were about getting out. Haggerty was thrown clear with his parachute still unattached. Below him was the English countryside. Above and around him were pieces of an aircraft that had been intact moments earlier. According to the account later preserved by his family, Haggerty managed to connect the parachute while he was falling. He pulled the ripcord. The collision had occurred at around 15,000 feet. The family account placed the opening of his parachute at approximately 2,500 feet. Whatever the exact altitude, the essential fact was simple. It opened. Haggerty survived. Later, after reaching a medical facility, he was still gripping the ripcord. The significance of that small object would not end with the war. But Haggerty was only one man, and Little Boy Blue was still coming apart above Suffolk. The rear of the bomber had separated from the main fuselage. Tail gunner Jim Bennett was inside that falling section. The exact second-by-second sequence of Bennett's escape cannot be reconstructed with complete certainty. Later accounts indicate that he managed to get clear of the separated tail and use his parachute. He survived as well. 2 men had escaped an aircraft breaking apart thousands of feet above the ground. 8 others did not. What happened next spread the story of Little Boy Blue across more than one location. The detached tail came down separately from the main wreckage. Decades later, local resident Brian Cracknell could still remember seeing it. He had been a schoolboy in 1944. After hearing of the crash, he and other boys crossed the fields toward the wreck. Near the railway line, they found the tail section. Cracknell remembered it as still hot, even steaming. To children accustomed to wartime aircraft passing overhead, the sight was still extraordinary. A large section of an American heavy bomber was simply lying in a field. No one was inside. The boys continued toward the main crash site, roughly a mile away. By then, military police and British authorities had secured the area and kept them back. Cracknell remembered seeing parachutes placed on the ground. He understood what they covered. For people living among the American airfields of East Anglia, aircraft accidents were an all too familiar part of wartime life. The children eventually went back to school. For the families of Little Boy Blue's crew, there would be no return to normal. 8 men were dead. 5 of those 8 were recovered. 3 were not. Pilot Walter Malaniak, co-pilot Aaron Brinkoeter, radio operator Ronald Grey. The main portion of Little Boy Blue had struck agricultural land near Thurston. There was fire. The aircraft was shattered. Wreckage lay across the fields. But the crash site that existed on July 19, 1944, would not remain frozen in place. The obvious wreckage was cleared. Recoverable remains were removed. Large sections of aircraft disappeared from the field. Farmers needed the land back. Pieces that interfered with cultivation were picked up, moved to field margins, or pushed aside. Material was reportedly deposited near an old pond. Other pieces ended up in hedges and ditches. Then the plows returned. Year after year the ground was worked. A plow does not make aluminium vanish. But it does destroy context. A fragment that once rested close to where the aircraft struck might be dragged away. Smaller pieces could move through the topsoil. Material left on the surface could be collected decades later with no record of its exact original position. Little Boy Blue slowly changed from a crash scene into a scatter. That distinction would become critical. Finding a piece of B-17 in the field was one problem. Knowing what that piece could say about where the aircraft had actually hit was another. The wreck was never completely forgotten. In 1986, amateur aircraft enthusiasts returned to investigate the site. Aircraft archaeology at the time was very different from the formal forensic recovery that would come later. Those involved described themselves as amateurs, interested in preserving aircraft history and rescuing pieces that could serve as memorial objects. The excavation reportedly recovered significant wreckage, including an airman's boot and a .50 caliber machine gun. The work showed that Little Boy Blue was still beneath and around the fields, but it also meant that the site had now gone through 2 separate rounds of disturbance. First came the wartime clearance. Decades later came another excavation. By the time a modern recovery team arrived, investigators were no longer dealing with an untouched 1944 crash site. In 2018, another survey revisited the area and found aircraft fragments around the fields. The evidence helped renew interest in the site, but the fundamental problem remained. 3 men were still missing. By September 2023, the reason for going back had changed completely. This was no longer an amateur search for aircraft parts. It was a formal recovery mission connected with the United States Defense POW MIA accounting agency. Cotswold Archaeology led the work on the ground. Operation Nightingale brought serving personnel and veterans into the project. Specialists from Cranfield University joined them, along with American military personnel, local volunteers, and others. Around 50 people would take part. Their priorities were explicit. Finding out more about the B-17 was useful. Recovering interesting pieces of wartime machinery was useful, but neither was the main objective. The primary objective was to recover evidence that could lead to the 3 missing airmen and, if possible, finally bring them home. That made the excavation unusually focused. Every piece of aircraft could help reconstruct where different sections had gone. Every concentration of metal might indicate where the fuselage broke up. Every area with almost no metal could be equally important. The team began with one of the best pieces of evidence available. A photograph taken shortly after the crash showed wreckage in the field. Investigators compared the old image with surviving roads, boundaries, and landscape features, and selected an area where they believed the main wreckage might have come down. They established grids. Test pits were opened. Soil was removed and passed through sieves. The expectation was straightforward. If a heavy bomber had broken apart there, even after wartime clearance and decades of farming, the ground should contain a substantial concentration of metal. Instead, the first area produced almost nothing. One possible aircraft fragment here or there was not enough. The emptiness itself became important. The team had started with a photograph and a reasonable interpretation. The ground was telling them that interpretation might be wrong. That was the first real turning point of the recovery. They did not keep digging simply because the original theory had looked convincing. They changed the search. Metal detectorists moved across the surrounding fields, placing flags at individual signals. The number of flags began increasing elsewhere. That was what investigators had expected to see around a bomber crash. The aircraft had not vanished. They had been looking in the wrong concentration. The search shifted toward the metal. Now the field began producing fragments more quickly. Some were tiny pieces of aluminium. Others still carried traces of wartime paint. A fragment with green paint might once have formed part of the aircraft's structure. Yellow-painted pieces raised questions about markings or internal components. Small rivets survived even where the sheets they had once held together were gone. One object carried the words, "Made in USA." Other fragments bore manufacturer markings. A plate connected with an engine exhaust component carried the name of General Motors and a 1943 date. None of these objects by themselves could identify a missing man. Their importance was cumulative. Every find could be mapped. Every mapped find added another point to the debris pattern. The investigators were no longer simply collecting wreckage. They were trying to make the wreckage reveal the shape of an event that had happened nearly 80 years before. Traditional archaeological excavation was only one part of the work. Magnetometry searched for magnetic changes beneath the surface. Resistivity looked for differences in the soil. Ground-penetrating radar offered another way to examine what lay below. Historic aerial photographs were compared with the modern landscape. A drone mapped the field from above. Photogrammetry searched for subtle rises and depressions, almost invisible from ground level. The techniques sounded sophisticated, but they were all being used to answer a surprisingly simple question. Where did the airplane go? At first, investigators expected part of that answer to be a crater. Earlier accounts had described a substantial impact scar. A 4-engined bomber falling from the sky seemed as though it should have left an unmistakable mark. The team therefore looked for disturbed ground, strong geophysical anomalies, and the kind of concentrated wreckage that might indicate a deep impact. Possible anomalies appeared. They were tested. The expected crater remained elusive. This was frustrating because the absence of a crater seemed to contradict the mental picture everyone carried into the field. But the growing wreckage pattern was beginning to suggest another possibility. Little Boy Blue had already lost its tail before the main section reached the ground. Some accounts described the remaining aircraft descending in a flat spin. The exact final attitude could not be reconstructed with certainty, and the archaeology could not transform an eyewitness description into a precise impact angle. But the surviving material did provide clues. Fragments were widespread. Most were relatively shallow. Some aluminium had melted, confirming that fire had occurred. Yet the team was not uncovering one enormous concentration of deeply buried aircraft. Perhaps that was because the main section had not driven steeply into the earth. Perhaps it had arrived relatively flat, struck hard, and broken across the surface. One description from the excavation captured the physical result better than an engineering diagram. Aluminium confetti. If that interpretation was broadly correct, the search for one perfect crater had always been too simple. The bomber had already been broken before it hit. Then the impact broke what remained into smaller pieces. Wartime clearance disrupted the pattern. Agriculture disrupted it again. The 1986 excavation removed more material. By 2023, the original crash survived as a pattern that had to be reconstructed from absence as much as presence. That also explained why the edges of the debris field mattered so much. Investigators found areas with almost nothing. Elsewhere, metal detector flags became dense. Between those zones, the aircraft began to acquire shape again. Fragments associated with different areas of a B-17 appeared across the site. Pieces thought to relate to the radio area appeared in one concentration. Material associated with the cockpit appeared elsewhere. Farther across the field, pieces connected with bomb-carrying equipment were identified. None of this allowed the team to place every section of Little Boy Blue to the inch, but it narrowed the search. And occasionally the aircraft produced something more intimate than structure. There were pieces that might have belonged to crew equipment. A clip associated with a flying helmet. A small component connected with the microphone control on a pilot's control yoke. Fasteners that might have had several wartime uses, including on parachute equipment. Such finds had to be treated cautiously. A component used on many B-17s could tell archaeologists about the aircraft without telling them which individual had touched it. That distinction mattered. The mission was not trying merely to prove that a B-17 had crashed in the field. Everyone already knew that. It was trying to find evidence connected with 3 specific men. As the excavation continued, the weather changed. The first days had been intensely hot, baking the soil and exhausting people working over grids and sieves. Then rain arrived. The hard ground became heavy mud. Sieving became slower. The basic process continued. Dig, screen, detect, map, identify. Reject what did not fit. Move toward what did. There was no guarantee that the field would provide the discovery everyone wanted. The missing men had been exposed to a violent aircraft breakup, impact, fire, wartime recovery work, later disturbance, and almost 80 years in agricultural soil. Forensic recovery begins with an objective, but it cannot declare success simply because something promising appears in the right place. Small fragments of osseous material were recovered during the investigation. That mattered because possible bone was directly relevant to the purpose of the mission. But the public evidence did not establish those fragments as human, much less identify them with any individual member of Little Boy Blue's crew. Anything of that kind required laboratory examination. Anything potentially connected to a missing serviceman had to be verified before families could be told what it meant. That caution was not a barrier to the recovery. It was part of the recovery. No one wanted an exciting find in the soil to become a false promise. Then, during the second week, a local metal detectorist found something that needed far less interpretation. The small metal tag was dirty but readable. It carried personal information. Most importantly, it carried a name: Aaron Brinkoeter. The object was taken to the team. The question followed, was there anyone on this flight called Aaron Brinkoeter? Yes, there was. He had been sitting beside Walter Malaniak in Little Boy Blue's cockpit. He had been one of the 8 men killed, and he was one of the 3 men whose remains had never been recovered. For days, the excavation had produced fragments that said Boeing, America, 1943, engine, cockpit, radio room, ammunition. Now, for the first time, an object said one man's name. The date made the discovery even more remarkable. It was September 12th. Aaron Brinkoeter had been born on September 12th, 1919. His identification tag had been recovered exactly 104 years after his birth. No archaeological interpretation was needed to make the coincidence memorable. The tag did not prove where every section of the aircraft had landed. It did not solve the crater problem. It did not identify human remains, and it did not mean Aaron Brinkoeter had finally been recovered. But it established a direct physical connection between the excavation and one of the men the team had been sent to find. Nearly 80 years after Brinkoeter disappeared, something that had carried his identity was still in the field. The scale of the object was almost the opposite of the machine he had flown. Little Boy Blue had been a 4-engined, heavy bomber designed to carry 10 men, guns, fuel, and bombs across occupied Europe. Its destruction had been violent enough to scatter sections of aircraft across the countryside. What now linked one of its missing crewmen to the site was a small, stamped piece of metal. Brinkoeter's family could be informed of the discovery. The find also changed the emotional geography of the excavation. Before the tag, the field contained evidence of Little Boy Blue. After the tag, it contained something unquestionably associated with Aaron Brinkoeter himself. The rest of the search continued. Aircraft fragments still emerged. The debris pattern became clearer. But there would be no cinematic moment when an intact cockpit appeared beneath the soil. There would be no crane lifting a recognizable flying fortress from a crater. There was no aircraft left to recover in that sense. The real recovery was slower and more difficult. It involved reconstructing where a bomber had broken apart, when almost every process since the crash had worked to disturb or erase the original pattern. And the final result remained incomplete. The field gave investigators evidence. It gave them wreckage. It gave them Brinkoeter's dog tag. It gave them possible osseous material that required further analysis. It did not simply return the 3 missing men. That distinction matters because aircraft recovery stories are often told backward from success. A wreck is discovered. It is excavated or raised. The pieces are restored. Eventually, the aircraft appears in a museum, recognizable again. Little Boy Blue could never have that kind of ending. The machine had been scattered too completely. What could be reconstructed instead was the relationship between the landscape, the aircraft, and the men who had disappeared with it. On July 19, 2024, exactly 80 years after the collision, people gathered near the crash site again. This time, there were no military police sealing off wreckage. There were relatives, veterans, serving personnel, archaeologists, local residents, and a permanent memorial. For the family of Ronald Grey, the service completed a wish that had existed for decades. Grey had been Little Boy Blue's radio operator. His body had never been recovered. A surviving letter from his mother had expressed the hope that one day there might be a service in the field where her son had died. She did not live to see it. 80 years after the crash, that service finally took place. The memorial also brought together families whose relatives had experienced very different endings on July 19, 1944. Some represented men whose bodies had been recovered. Some represented men who were still missing. And one family carried an object that connected the ceremony directly to the seconds after Little Boy Blue broke apart in the sky. Hal Haggerty had survived. His son Patrick stood near the crash site and told the story of what happened after his father reached the ground. At the medical facility, a doctor had been questioning Haggerty while taking notes. Haggerty was still holding something tightly in his hand. The doctor eventually told him, "Son, you can put the ripcord down now." Then Patrick showed the object. The ripcord had survived. So had a piece of the parachute. In 1944, Hal Haggerty had fallen from a disintegrating B-17 with that ripcord in his hand. 8 decades later, his son was standing near the same crash field, holding it again. For Haggerty, that piece of equipment marked the moment survival became possible. Aaron Brinkoeter left behind a very different object. His dog tag had remained within the debris field until it was found nearly 80 years later. There was no need to turn either object into something larger than the evidence allowed. Their histories were already enough. One had traveled away from the crash with a survivor. The other remained in the landscape after the man whose name it carried never came home. Around them, the countryside had changed almost beyond recognition. The wartime emergency crews were gone. The damaged tail had disappeared from beside the railway. The main wreckage had been removed. The impact scar, remembered or described after the crash, could no longer be confidently identified as one obvious crater. Fields had been plowed and replowed. Aircraft fragments had moved toward hedges and ditches. Amateur excavators had returned. Surveyors had returned. Then archaeologists and recovery specialists had come again. Yet small pieces of July 19, 1944 had remained. A painted rivet, a manufacturer plate, melted aluminum, a machine gun component, a fragment from the cockpit or radio compartment, possible bone that required scientific examination, and a dog tag carrying the name of a missing co-pilot. There were also memories held by people who had been children when the aircraft came down, and objects preserved by the families of the men who survived. The 2023 excavation did not transform Little Boy Blue into a restored bomber. It did something more limited, and for this case, more important. It narrowed the physical story of the crash. It showed where wreckage remained concentrated and where it did not. It challenged the expectation that one obvious buried crater would explain everything. It recovered objects connected with different parts of the aircraft. It revealed how thoroughly decades of clearance, digging, and agriculture had altered the site. And, in the middle of thousands of anonymous fragments, it recovered the name of one of the men everyone had come to find. The outcome was not complete. 2 members of Little Boy Blue's crew survived the breakup. 8 died. 5 of those 8 were recovered. Walter Malaniak, Aaron Brinkoeter, and Ronald Grey were not. That was true when the field was cleared in 1944. It remained the reason an official recovery mission returned almost 80 years later. The 2023 excavation did not close their cases, but it changed what could still be learned from the place where they disappeared. Today, there is no enormous B-17 lying across the field. A passerby could cross the landscape without realizing that 10 young Americans once fell toward this ground inside and around a bomber that had been cut apart in the air. Most of Little Boy Blue has disappeared from sight. But not everything disappeared. A ripcord survived because one man carried it out of the sky. A dog tag remained in the field, while the man whose name it carried never came home. And nearly 80 years after Little Boy Blue fell over Suffolk, the story of Walter Malaniak, Aaron Brinkoeter, and Ronald Grey remained unfinished.